Good afternoon, good morning. See Martha there. Maddie, is your name Maddie or Maddie? How do you pronounce it?
Maddie, you had it right.
Nice to have you with us, Maddie. Were you with us last week?
I was not. I just joined this week.
Okay, got it. Well, welcome. Glad to have you here. This is the second of two conversations we're having around the topic of feedback. Hello, Jessica. Nice to see you as usual. Looks like you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed as always. Welcome to other folks here as well. For those who are here, if you're here and you're new, I'd like to ask everybody to turn on your video if you can, please. It's a fact of leadership that leadership is about relationship, and as long as we're discussing and exploring the topic of leadership, it's good for us to try to develop relationships in every way we can. So if you're able to turn on your video, I'd certainly ask you to do that. Shauna, nice to see you again. Welcome. Good morning. Nice to have you with us. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is David Severance. I am with Chirag Shah Coaching. I'm the Chief Leadership Officer here. Chirag and I have been doing these calls since, well, spring of 2020. For this year, I've been doing the calls on Wednesdays. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, Chirag does his calls on Mondays and Tuesdays. We'll continue this schedule going forward. We may change some things around a little bit as we get into the fall season later on, but you can trust that Chirag will continue his calls probably on Mondays and Tuesdays, and all of the expert mentors will continue their calls on Wednesdays or Thursdays. So welcome everyone. Glad to have you with us here. I'm going to start by asking you the same question that I asked last week. How many of you, please put a yes into the chat box if this is you. Oh, hi, Luciana. Nice to see you. How many of you showed up today hoping to hear some magical secret phrase that you can use when giving feedback to somebody that'll make them do whatever you want in exactly the way you want for the rest of time? Nice fantasy, says Jessica. Sure. So I'm glad everybody recognizes that. Let's see. Welcome, Marianne, as well. I'm glad everyone recognizes that. Unfortunately, humanity is not that simple. The fact that we're here talking about how to do feedback tells us that it's not easy and it's probably not simple. And that's the reality. It's not. We talked last time about receiving feedback. Today, we're going to focus on giving feedback. I won't assume that you are a team leader. I know that there's some independent agents on the call, but what we'll be talking about today is really applicable to anyone that you have a relationship with, where you feel that you have authority to be in a conversation with them about their performance. This might be vendors you work with. This might be people on your team. Certainly, you can apply some of these principles to other relationships that you might have in your life. Second question, please put into the chat, what is your personal biggest challenge around giving feedback to others? What is it that stops you from doing it? Or what is it that gets you into trouble? What's the barrier or the derailer or the mindset or what that gets in your way? And try to be specific. I don't want to hurt people, hurting their feelings, toning down my approach. Conversations can go negative so easily. Wonderful. That's clearly the number one kind of sentiment for people. When I give talks like this around the country and in different places, I hear that over and over and over again. We would like to see someone performing or working with us or living with us and relating with us in a different way, but we're afraid for how they might take it. We're afraid for what might happen in the relationship in the short term if we give some kind of negative feedback. I see Jessica saying, not knowing how to start and not scheduling. Great. I've said we need to make a correction. It's been in the moment, not scheduled. Okay, we're going to talk about that a little bit. One thing I didn't mention last time is there's two types of feedback, what we call solicited and unsolicited. So solicited feedback is feedback that's already agreed to at a certain point in time. And so when you have an agreement with somebody else that you work with, that we're going to gather once a month or once a week or whatever it is to have a conversation about how we're working together, That's a totally different kind of conversation from the ones we typically have every day, which is how do we solve the problem with this deal? How do we solve a problem with that deal? From a leadership and management point of view, you have to have conversations that are outside just solving problems with deals. And when many of us look at the conversations that we have with people, typically, we tend to have only those problem solving or deal managing conversations. To be effective over time as a team, you need to come together from time to time with the express purpose of not talking about day-to-day business, but talking about how you're working together, how you feel about working together, and how you can explore different ways of working together. And so you can do that on a solicited basis or unsolicited. Solicited means you set those conversations aside and you have them at a scheduled time. You're both prepared for it. It's all good from that point of view. There's, of course, a lot of times where we might give unsolicited feedback to somebody, and it doesn't have to be negative. It could be, hey, great job with the client this morning, or wow, you really nailed that pitch. That's feedback. It's unsolicited. And sometimes when we receive unsolicited feedback, especially if it's negative, we tend to take it in an uncomfortable way. One of the things that we have to recognize is that people tend to conflate feedback about performance as feedback about them as a human being. And this is where we get into trouble. If I say to you, I don't like the way that you handled that particular contract negotiation, that's different from saying, I think you're a bad agent or I think you're a bad person. The problem is, of course, that people tend to hear that if you're criticizing my behavior, you're criticizing me. And of course, this is something that they say similarly for the parents with kids, right? They say criticize the action, not the child. And so even though we're adults and we're supposed to be beyond that kind of stuff, still, it's hard to hear feedback that we consider negative or judgmental without it seeing it as an indictment of ourselves as people. And of course, that's where it's easy to get into trouble. So when we talk about feedback here today, obviously it's a big topic and we're not going to be able to cover everything, but I want to give you a couple of things to keep in mind. I hope that there's one little insight or one little element of what I share that you can take next time you have to give feedback to somebody. So let me pull up some slides. We'll talk about the slides a little bit, and then we'll have a few minutes after that to go in a little further detail. All right. All right, effective feedback. Now, it's important to recognize that feedback, as I said before, feedback is simply information that you can use to make decisions about how to do business. That's really all feedback is. And I gave the example of a gas gauge last time. A gas gauge in your car is a simple feedback device. It doesn't tell you whether you should get gas now or not. It just tells you how much gas is in the tank. And you need to use that information to make the right choice for you in operating the car. In terms of business, feedback is the same thing. It's information that you can use in the moment to make the right choices. So feedback can be anything. It's like, what are my clients telling me about my service or our team's service? Or what is my conversion rate? That's some kind of form of feedback about how effective I am. Or how many people, compliment me after a pitch that I give or a presentation, even if I work, as a volunteer somewhere or in my church or whatever, what kind of things do people say to me afterwards? This is information we can use to decide whether we want to keep doing things the way we have or doing things differently. One of the things I mentioned last time was this simple framework for giving feedback, which we call start, stop, continue. Many corporations use this when a person is giving feedback to someone that they work with regularly. This is often done for someone for their boss or for someone underneath them from the boss's direction. It can be either direction. They use a simple framework, start, stop, continue. Here are things I would like you to start doing. Here are things I would like you to stop doing. Here are things I would like you to continue doing. And then the conversation follows from there. Okay, so, what makes it, why do you mention that particular thing to start or to stop or whatever? And then you go a little bit deeper into the person's rationale for asking those particular things. So as a simple framework for you, you can think about when you work with somebody, what would you like that person to start doing? What would you like that person to stop doing? What would you like that person to continue doing? Or a different version of this, which is also a little bit on the soft side, for those of you who want to tone it down a little bit, you can use do more, do less. Do more means here's some things I'd like you to do more of, because they work really well. And you have to give the reason why. Here's some things I'd like you to do less of, and you can give your reasoning there as well. that comes across generally for most folks as relatively soft. It's not a huge indictment on them. It's not saying you're bad. It's actually just saying, I'd like to see more of this. I'd like to see less of that. Now, as we'll see in just a moment, it's more than just having a simple framework like that. And it's more than simply, having a simple conversation or way of delivering the information. What else comes into making feedback successful over time? A whole lot of things. Here are a couple of guidelines to keep in mind. Now, I'll apologize first because all these slides together, there's a lot of information in here. And so you'll probably have to go back onto the platform tomorrow or whenever and refer back to a couple of these things. But if you want to take a note or two as you go through, like just put a little note next to something that's, maybe important for you to keep in mind. But certainly, this call, like all calls, will be available to everybody on the platform shortly. So what are some guidelines for a feedback conversation? Well, a few things. First, you need to remember that a feedback conversation should be a dialogue, not a diatribe. A diatribe is where you do all the talking and it's critical in nature. A dialogue is a two-way conversation where both people are providing input to try to reach clarity or greater awareness. So there should be a two-way nature to it. And it should be not just about what's negative, but what's positive. That's inherent in the framework I just gave you, which is start, stop, continue, right? In the continue part, what you're saying is, this is going really well. I want you to continue that. That's valuable information because the person may not know whether that's something they should continue or not. And same with the do more, do less. If it's do more, that you're saying, I like what you're doing there, keep doing that or do more of it. Second, evidence is better than opinions. If you have the chance to observe someone in action and you want to provide some feedback for them later about their performance, it's better to have some data to back that up. So for example, instead of just saying, you're not serious about your work, you might say, you've been late for the last 4 meetings in a row, right? That's a different kind of feedback. Or to say, you got to get better at your pitches is different from saying, you've had 9 pitches this year and you haven't gotten 1 client out of it, right? And so sometimes it's useful when you're able to be able to gather some kind of data so that whatever your feedback is grounded in reality, not an opinion. It's harder for somebody to argue with you when the reality is there. I've had some corporate clients in the past who were accused of talking too much in meetings. These are leaders of teams who talked all the time in meetings. Everybody complained about it. And I remember one guy in particular, he was accused of talking more than 80% of the time in the meetings, and nobody else ever got to contribute to the conversation. So he didn't believe it. He didn't think that he ever talked more than about 40% of the meeting. So what do? We actually had someone with a timer. Over a month of meetings, this person actually kept a stopwatch in the meeting and clicked it on every time that he started talking and clicked it off every time he stopped. And guess what? About 85% of the time was him talking. That was a huge awareness for him that he just didn't expect at all. But he couldn't argue with it because he knew that the person had actually timed it. Number 3, when you're thinking about how you might approach giving feedback to somebody, ask yourself the same question. What would make you most likely to accept and act on this feedback? If someone were to give this feedback to you that you're thinking to give to someone else, how would you like to hear it? How would you like that person to phrase it within the context of your relationship? Sometimes that can give you a good insight in how you might want to phrase it. And finally, recognize that feedback is not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing self-correcting mechanism that you engage in for success over a period of time. So you might not get the behavior that you're looking for after one conversation, but you don't have to expect that either. Same thing with raising your children. You know you're not going to raise a perfect kid in one conversation, but you're hoping that over time you can develop that kid and have a relationship with the kid over time so the kid learns right from wrong and those kinds of things. So it's important to understand that feedback is not something that should be uncomfortable. It's not something that should be career ending or relationship ending. It's an ongoing, regular conversation about how we can do the best we can do. So those are some guidelines just to keep in mind in general. Let's go a little further. Most people think that their effectiveness in delivering feedback depends on how they phrase the feedback. And while that's important, there are actually other items that are more important to your success over the long term. If you want to have a relationship with someone who accepts your feedback, is willing to explore it with you, and then is willing to make adjustments going forward, not for everything perhaps, but in a true dialogue and spirit of collaboration to improve. The number one thing you need to have is not how you say things, it's actually the quality of your relationship in the first place. People who don't like you, don't respect you, don't think you like them, don't think you respect them, they are not going to buy into your feedback no matter what. It's very, very hard to succeed if you have a weak relationship. And if you're so concerned about about how the person might receive the feedback, to me as a coach, that's a flag that your relationship may not be strong enough. Yes, it's very hard to give people feedback that they can act on and feel comfortable to let's say, take to heart and act on. But nonetheless, it is an important factor for us for high performance over time. What else matters? The context of the conversation. That is, when is the conversation happening? How often is it happening? Have you both bought into this process ahead of time that it's important for us to meet from time to time to talk about these things? We're used to talking about things in the business to make them better. We'll talk all about processes and how to enter things in the CRM and do stuff like that. But when we're talking in the same way about human behavior, somehow it becomes a different deal. 3, the validity of your statements matter. That's why we're talking about gathering data before. And finally, only after those other 3, how you deliver the messages matters. If you think that the only thing that matters is number 4 and you miss number 3, you're never going to succeed. If you have a poor relationship and the relationship and the conversation, let's say, comes out of the blue, it's unsolicited, and it's all opinion, or it sounds like it's all opinion rather than having any kind of data behind it, doesn't matter how you phrase it, the person is not going to go along with it. So you need to be successful over time in building a relationship. If you want that successful feedback conversation to happen on June 10th, guess what you need to be doing right now? Building the relationship between now and June 10th. Only this 4th one is interpersonal mastery, and that's where people want that magic phrase. Unfortunately, it simply doesn't exist. Every human is unique. Every situation is unique. Every feedback conversation is unique. But if you can develop a good relationship over time, if you can have a context for the relationship, which is we do this because it's important and we do it once a week or once a month or whatever it is, and if your statements have some validity when you can, it's not always possible, but certainly when it can be helpful. And if you deliver the messages in a way that's appropriate for that person at that moment, all those things help support a successful, in a sense, transaction here, feedback transaction, let's call it that. Okay, next. Before the conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about before, during, and after here. So before the conversation, here are a couple of things to keep in mind. 1, gather the data if possible, when you can. Secondly, it's important, it's even crucial for you in your own mind, based on the data that you have or whatever perspective you have, you need to be clear about what the messages are that you want to deliver or the impacts that you want the person to have from hearing those messages. I suggest you write them down on a piece of paper in black and white. When they're in your head, you think it's clear, you think it's sensible, you think it's logical. But if you wrote on a piece of paper, what I want Susan to come away from this conversation understanding is, and then just bullet point 1, 2, 3. That can help you clarify what it is you need to say. What I find very often is the person will offer some kind of feedback and the person doesn't receive it very well because it wasn't quite thought out in their mind. And then the feedback giver says something like, well, what I think I'm trying to say is. Well, if you're saying what I think I'm trying to say, that probably tells me you're not quite clear about what it is you wanted to say, or you weren't able to say it clearly enough the first time. So if that's a habit for you, you find yourself often saying what I think I'm trying to say, then you might benefit from more preparation ahead of time. And writing it down can make a big difference. Finally, it's important to invite the person into the conversation. I suggest that you create a solicited schedule for having these conversations. You agree that with the people you work with, you'll talk once every 6 months or once every 3 months or once every month, whatever it is. And you set the time ahead of time, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever, time block it into your calendar. If you haven't done that, at least you can invite someone into the process now to begin it. And you can say something like, as you know, Susan, we're all committed to performing at our best. Would you be willing to talk with me about how you're doing and how we can help you be as effective as possible? It's hard for somebody to say no to that. But if somebody does say no to that, I have to challenge you to say, why are you working with this person? We should all be interested in trying to get better. We should all be interested in hearing feedback. We should all be asking for feedback from time to time, as we talked last time. You want to have someone else who's willing to be in this exploration with you. Now, remember, feedback should come from a place of caring and empathy and support and teamwork and good business practices and all of that. It doesn't come from I'm going to tell you what's wrong with you, and you need to conform to my way of life or my way of living or my way of doing business. All right. So during the meeting, 3 important things to do. Number 1, restate the purpose of the meeting just so that you're both clear and on the same page. We're here today to share our thoughts with each other about how you're doing and how you can be as successful as possible. It's important to restate the purpose because you may have set this meeting a week ago, 2 weeks ago, a month ago. This person may be coming into the conversation with a different idea, like, oh, now I'm going to get my ass chewed off by my boss. Or here comes Maddie, and she's always so unreasonable about everything, and she's going to tell me how terrible I am when she's unreasonable and she doesn't even see what's happening. That may be what they come into the conversation with. And it's important for you to reset their thinking a little bit, to say, we're just here to talk with each other about how things are going and how we can both help you be as successful as possible. It sets a context for what the conversation should be. Secondly, when you share your feedback, you must be prepared to listen. This goes back to calling it a dialogue and not a diatribe. You have to be able to hear what it is the person is saying so that they have a space in the conversation. If it's a one-way conversation, they have no space in there to respond, to consider, to process, to adjust. It's just take it or leave it, my way or the highway. And that relates to number 3 here, which is making it a dialogue. Ask questions. Does that make sense to you? How do you feel about that? What would you need to succeed here? What's getting in your way? What are you struggling with? All of these things should be part of the feedback conversation. You may have a couple of points that you want the person to hear. That's perfectly natural and it's appropriate. But they may have some ideas too. And so it should be a dialogue where they're sharing what matters to them. What's getting in your way of being more successful? Why is that causing a problem for you? How can I help you mitigate that? Right? These kinds of things make it a conversation. And once the person recognizes that this is a dialogue geared to helping that person perform well, and you're willing to meet them somewhere in the middle and collaborate, then it's no longer a fearful thing for them. The reason that we tend to be fearful about these conversations is we've had bad experiences in the past, and we're just kind of like carrying that with us to transfer it here. But whoever you might have feedback for, I assume you care for that person. You want that person to be happy and successful and all of that. And that needs to come out. And one way to do that is to make sure that it's a dialogue, a shared discussion about how you can both contribute to the success that you're looking for. Okay. Finally, after, you can consider taking any of these steps. Send an email. I suggest sending an email afterwards just for clarity purposes, also for accountability purposes. If this is someone that you've given feedback to and they've agreed to something and you're not exactly sure if they really want to follow through, send an email first saying thank you. It's the number one most important thing. You should say thank you in the conversation, of course. But in the email, just say, hey, thanks again for taking the time to talk with me last week. I think these conversations are so valuable for our business, and I appreciate your time. And then restate whatever the agreements are. I'm so glad you'll be focusing on your pitches for the next month. I really have great optimism that you're going to be able to nail this. Let me know when you need any support. And finally, just as a reminder, if it's an ongoing thing, which I suggest you do, we'll talk again in early June to see how things are going. You're putting it out there to the person that recognize that this is an ongoing process that you're both interested in participating in the interest of long-term high performance. That's all you need to do. These are the simple things that you can do to put yourself on the right track for having good conversations. Keep those original guidelines in mind. Think about the before, think about the during, and think about the after. Now, Jessica mentioned last time emotion, so I wanted to throw in 2 slides about dealing with emotion. Emotion is an important element here, and this is where we typically go off the rails. You know, when I ask people, what's the difference between difference and conflict? If I say, can you have difference with a person without having conflict? People will say, yes, you can. But sometimes you have conflict with a person that's kind of like part and parcel of the difference. And so when you give feedback to somebody and they maybe have a different perspective on that, it might just be a different perspective and you're both willing to explore each other's perspective. There's no conflict involved. But sometimes conflict does occur. Like, how dare you say that? That's way off base. I can't believe that. Right? What's happening there is an emotional experience is coming up for one person there. Usually the person who's receiving the feedback. Sometimes could be in the course of the conversation. It's you, the person giving the conversation, giving the feedback. So what can you do with emotion? Well, a couple of things I need you to, that are important to understand. First, you need to understand that moderate or strong emotions are capable of actually hijacking the rest of your brain, right? That's the seat of emotion is in the amygdala. It's in the mid part of your brain, and it's attached to the hippocampus, which is associated with memory. And so people who are bringing past experiences into a conversation very easily can have an experience of emotion, frustration, nervousness, anger. Any of those things could come up at any moment around a feedback conversation. Even before a feedback conversation, a person could come in a little bit triggered. And so when that happens, our brain actually, the front part of our brain, which is where the cognition takes place, the prefrontal cortex, actually shuts down. And if you get so triggered that you're in your emotions so deeply, you actually can't use any part of the front of your brain. So for example, you imagine a time you were really, really angry, like you were livid. You found out something terrible about the person you're married with, or you found out your partner's stealing money from the business. If I asked you during that moment to take your zip code and add the first 3 digits together, and then add the second 3 digits together and multiply them and then subtract 67, you probably say, I can't do that right now. I'm just so angry, right? That's like actually what happens. Our ability to cognate actually pauses for a period of time until that emotion comes back down again. Why does this matter? I'll tell you in the next slide. To mitigate this, it's important for you to assess what the emotional gradient, the level of emotion might be for the person ahead of time. Depending on what that person is coming into the conversation with, like maybe they've had a string of bad luck or bad experiences, or maybe that the feedback you're going to give them is pretty serious stuff and you know that they're not going to want to hear it. You need to assess the signals of emotional distress in real time. Does that person speed up their breathing? Do they start turning red in the face? Do they ball their hands into a fist? Right? You can recognize these elements that might be coming out in their body language. And you need to make adjustments to your plan when necessary, because the emotions, whenever they're moderate or severe, you need to manage the emotion before you can continue the dialogue, because the person's not capable of continuing the dialogue because this part of the brain is no longer functioning. This is an important piece of it. We want to deliver the message and we want to get them to take the message, but they kind of like keep going over their head and pretty soon we're yelling at each other. These kinds of things happen in arguments all the time. The only way for us to actually have the person get back to the point where they can actually consider our argument or our perspective, our feedback, is to let the emotion come down. So what do? Well, as soon as you sense that a person might be having some emotional experience, you need to address that. And at least you can ask, I'm sensing that this is bringing up some emotion, some frustration, or it looks like you might be getting a little frustrated with this conversation. Am I reading that correctly or not? Or some version of this that you're comfortable with. And if the person says, yeah, I'm getting pretty hot because I don't think that that's really valid, a valid statement, then you need to decide whether you should continue the conversation or not. Because the higher that emotional gradient goes, the less able that person is to mentally process what it is you're trying to deliver in the first case. It also could be that the conversation is, bringing this up for you. And in that particular case, maybe you need to pull yourself out of the conversation and say, you know what, something's coming up for me now. It's preventing me from really hearing what it is you want to say. So can we continue the conversation tomorrow? There's nothing wrong with continuing a conversation at another time. That's why I said before, this is an ongoing process, right? It's an ongoing process that we can be in together as long as we work together or live together. And so for you, Jessica, and for everybody, you need to pay attention to the emotion. You pay attention to it beforehand, like how likely is this person to get triggered to any degree by what I'm going to say? And then in the moment, you want to be watching it as well. And if you detect some of that, you have to go there. You have to pause a little bit and say, I'm sensing something's happening here. Can we talk about that for a minute? If they're not too triggered, they'll say, yeah, I'm getting a little bit, hot about this. If they're getting a little more triggered, they're going to say, you know what? I don't want to talk about it. I'm just like pissed off right now. If that's the case, then you really need to reconsider whether you should continue the conversation or not. And in many cases, there's no point continuing. I was on the receiving end of unsolicited and unfounded feedback from a customer. Bit my tongue. Yeah, I got it, Jessica. Thank you. So, sometimes when it's unsolicited, especially if you find it as unfounded or unreasonable or whatever, it's natural that, your gradient goes up. Almost any human would have that reaction. So quickly, what are some things you can do now as a simple step to get yourself started along this path? One, choose one person in your life that you want to give feedback to. If you have the option of observing that person in action, consider doing that for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever. Once you've done that, think about what the feedback is that you want to give that person and write it down so that you're clear in your own mind exactly what it is you want that person to hear. And finally, invite that person into a conversation. That's how you get started, and then you can follow any of these guidelines that I've shared today. So let me ask everyone, we're basically at 1 o'clock, but I just want to get a little feedback from you. Please put into the chat box right now, is this very helpful, helpful, not so helpful, not helpful at all? Any of those 4 options. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody, for your feedback. As long as we're on the topic of feedback, I'll say to you, Chirag and I and everybody else here are interested in hearing your feedback at any time. You're clients of ours. We want you to have a good experience here. And so I say on the end of many of my calls, contact me anytime, david@chiragshahcoaching.com. Happy to hear your feedback about any of these calls or anything else that we do for you. So good luck with all of this, folks. It's not a skill that you'll be able to develop overnight, but you have some tactics here that you can apply and follow your gut for the other stuff. Maybe I should be softer, maybe I should be more firm. Follow your gut and see how it goes. And over time, you should be able to develop more success in giving feedback. Thanks, everybody. We'll come back to feedback a little bit later in the year when we talk about managing performance. But great to see everybody here today. Go out and make the contribution to the world that only you can make, and we'll see you again next Wednesday. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, David. Awesome class.
Thank you.